If you've dated a Sigma INFJ, who could read your emotional landscape before you'd even entered the room, who seemed to understand what you needed before you knew yourself, but who used that perfect understanding as a weapon, this video reveals exactly why they could do this. More importantly, you're not broken, and you were never alone in this experience. There exists a particular archetype within the INFJ landscape. Most people know INFJs as the healers, the empaths, the ones who feel everything and carry the world's pain in their nervous systems. That's accurate for most of them. But there's a subset operating from an entirely different psychological framework. They possess the same intuitive architecture as other INFJs, the same ability to read the invisible currents beneath surface behavior, the same capacity to know things about people they shouldn't possibly know. The distinction is this: they've separated understanding from empathy. They can see you perfectly, they simply choose not to care what they see. This is the Sigma INFJ, and they are fundamentally different from every other personality type, because their weapon of choice is not ignorance but perfect clarity. The tragedy of loving a Sigma INFJ is that you finally encounter someone who truly sees you. Not the version of you that you present to the world, not the sanitized performance you've crafted across decades, but the actual architecture of who you are. The fears beneath the confidence, the shame beneath the accomplishments, the loneliness beneath the charm. This is intoxicating, this is transcendent. This is the moment when most people fall completely into these relationships, believing they've finally found someone worth the vulnerability, someone safe enough to trust with the real version of themselves. And here's where it becomes genuinely unsettling. They saw you. They genuinely, completely, with startling accuracy, understood exactly who you were. And they stayed anyway, knowing precisely how to maneuver through your vulnerabilities, exactly which buttons to press, and most catastrophically, exactly how much you would forgive them, because they understood you in ways that felt sacred. The first thing you need to understand about a Sigma INFJ is this peculiar phenomenon I call selective empathy deployment. This is not the absence of empathy. It's far more calculated than that. Imagine walking into a therapy session with someone who is brilliantly attuned to every micro-expression on your face. They notice when your breath catches. They hear the slight tremor in your voice that indicates fear rather than anger. They know, without you saying a word, that you're terrified of abandonment, because they've watched you sabotage every relationship that approached genuine closeness. They have this information. They understand the architecture of your psychology. But this empathetic attunement is not evenly distributed. It appears when you're valuable to them, when understanding you serves their interests, and when your vulnerability is useful. And it vanishes completely when you've become inconvenient, when your needs contradict their agenda, when understanding you would require accountability. Here's what makes this truly bizarre. Because they can be extraordinarily empathetic in certain moments, you spend years questioning whether the cold indifference you experienced was actually cold indifference, or whether you're misinterpreting their distance as malice. Perhaps they were simply having a bad day. Perhaps their trauma was triggered. Perhaps you were being unfair. This constant oscillation between profound attunement and complete emotional absence creates a disorienting psychological environment where you stop trusting your own perceptions. You've experienced their empathy. You know they're capable of it, so when they're cruel, you assume the cruelty must somehow be your responsibility. Consider this specific scenario. You've had an extraordinarily difficult day. Someone at work undermined you publicly. You're carrying the weight of that humiliation. You come home hoping for comfort, for someone to witness your pain, and simply sit with you in it. Your Sigma INFJ partner looks at you and says, "You seem upset." They know you're upset. They can read it in every aspect of your body language. But rather than offering support, they launch into a detailed explanation of why the situation at work actually reflects your own insecurity, why you're probably overreacting, and why you need to develop thicker skin. They're not wrong. The analysis is intelligent and actually quite accurate. but it's an analysis rather than a presence. And the cruelest part is that you know they understood exactly what you needed in that moment. They understood that you needed comfort, not analysis. They understood this perfectly. They simply chose to offer the thing that would destabilize you further, wrapped in the language of helping you improve. This is different from normal relationship conflict. This is someone weaponizing their understanding. This is the shadow side of that INFJ superpower, that ability to see into the machinery of human psychology and pull the levers that create maximum impact. And this is where it becomes dislocating. You cannot even take comfort in the fact that they don't understand you, because they do. They understand you better than almost anyone you'll ever encounter. The harm they cause is not born of ignorance. It's born of clarity paired with indifference. But here's what makes this phenomenon so profoundly strange. Many Sigma INFJs are simultaneously conscious of what they're doing. They possess a kind of brutal self-awareness that's almost worse than unconscious cruelty. They'll tell you, with surprising honesty, that they don't always care about your pain. They'll explain, with disconcerting articulation, that their empathy is context-dependent, and that your needs sometimes simply don't register as important enough to activate it. And because they're framing this as self-knowledge rather than confession, because they're positioning their inability to consistently care about you as evidence of their psychological sophistication, you find yourself almost accepting it. You find yourself thinking, well, at least they're honest about it, at least they're not pretending. This is the intellectual equivalent of a trap. They've weaponized honesty into a form of accountability avoidance. The second phenomenon worth exploring is what I call the constructed narrative. Sigma INFJs are often extraordinarily skilled storytellers. They understand narrative structure instinctively because they understand human psychology instinctively. They know which personal stories create sympathy. They understand the precise emotional beats that make people protective of them. They know exactly how much vulnerability to reveal to create a sense of intimacy without genuine exposure. And here's where it gets absolutely wild. They're often not even consciously lying. They've simply learned to construct emotionally true narratives, even if they're factually suspect. Imagine your partner tells you a devastating story about their childhood. An emotionally unavailable parent. Trauma that still haunts them. Deep wounds that explain their current relationship struggles. You listen to this story and feel the appropriate compassion. You become protective. You structure your entire relationship around supporting someone through their pain. And then, years later, you encounter a family member who describes their childhood very differently. The parent they characterized as cold was actually quite warm. The trauma was exaggerated or partly fabricated. The narrative you've believed for years, the one that shaped how you related to them, was constructed rather than true. But here's what makes this truly unsettling. They're not lying in the way that ordinary people lie. They're not deliberately setting out to deceive you. They've learned to tell the stories that produce the response they need. They've studied human psychology long enough to understand exactly which confessions make people fall in love with them, which vulnerabilities make people want to save them, which emotional revelations create a sense of being specially chosen, uniquely trusted. The narratives are performances refined through multiple iterations. They're rehearsed vulnerability, they're choreographed intimacy. And this creates a particular kind of psychological damage. You don't just experience betrayal when you discover the truth, you experience a sort of existential disorientation. Because you have to question every interaction you had with them during which they were vulnerable. Were they performing? Were they testing to see if you'd stay with them when they revealed their flaws? Or were they telling a story that happened to be false? The uncertainty becomes worse than the lie. Because at least with a simple lie you can understand the mechanism. You can understand what they were trying to gain. But with Sigma INFJ narratives, you can never quite know where the performance ends, and the authentic begins. And perhaps in many cases the distinction doesn't even exist for them. The third phenomenon is something I call the empathetic mirror. This is perhaps the most insidious because it feels like love. Sigma INFJs will often perfectly reflect back to you everything you want to see in a partner. You're ambitious. Suddenly, they're fascinated with your career trajectory and your ambitions. You value intellectual depth. They engage with you on a philosophical level that feels transcendent. You've spent your life feeling misunderstood. Finally, here is someone who understands everything. You like adventure. They become adventurous. You value stability. They become reliable. They shift and change in response to you with a fluidity that feels almost supernatural. But here's what makes this profoundly strange. This mirroring is not reciprocal. You don't get to know who they actually are beneath the reflection. Because there's often very little beneath the surface, they've learned to construct identity based on what will keep the person they're targeting most engaged. They've studied the architecture of desire and attachment long enough to understand how to present themselves as the answer to every longing. The mirror doesn't show you who they are, it shows you who you want them to be. Consider this scenario. You meet someone who seems to understand your value system at a level that feels almost mystical. They share your interest in depth and psychology. They engage with the same philosophers you love. They seem to have arrived at the same conclusions about what matters in life. For months or years, you experience what feels like intellectual and emotional alignment. You finally feel genuinely understood. And then, slowly, you start to notice inconsistencies. They contradict themselves about books they claim to love. They seem less interested in philosophical discussions when they're not with you. When you mention something they care deeply about, they seem vague about their actual position on it. What you slowly begin to realize is that they've been mirroring your value system back to you. They've learned what you care about and presented it back as if they care about it too. But the cruelty of this realization is that you can't even be entirely certain. Perhaps they do care about these things. Perhaps they're not engaged in every moment. Perhaps you're being unfair, expecting them to maintain the same level of intensity about philosophy that you do. And this ambiguity is precisely what makes it so destructive. You've lost your ability to trust your own perceptions about whether they're authentic or performing. The fourth and fifth phenomena I want to explore are interconnected. They involve what I call the disappearance, and its correlate, the reappearance. These are temporal manipulation patterns. A Sigma INFJ will often withdraw completely from your life. They'll go silent for days, sometimes weeks. No explanation. No acknowledgement of your messages. No indication of whether they're alive or if you've done something catastrophically wrong. During these periods, your entire nervous system is in a state of dysregulation. You're oscillating between anger, fear, and the desperate hope that you haven't destroyed the relationship through some invisible failing. And then they reappear. They come back, as suddenly as they vanished. They offer an explanation that may or may not be true, often with just enough vulnerability or honesty to make you feel like they're being transparent. They might say they were processing something difficult, or they needed space, or they were dealing with their own trauma. And because they've reappeared, because they're present and attentive again, you experience a flood of relief. The abandonment pain lifts. The relationship suddenly feels stable again. You forget, temporarily, that this pattern will repeat. You forget that the disappearance will happen again. Here's what makes this profoundly unsettling. This is not accidental inconsistency. This is a sophisticated pattern of creating what attachment researchers call anxious preoccupation. By being intensely present in some moments and completely absent in others, they've trained your nervous system to become hypervigilant. You've learned to read every microsignal from them. You've become attuned to their moods and their availability in a way that borders on obsession. Your entire emotional stability has become dependent on their presence. You've become, quite literally, addicted to the relief of their reappearance because the terror of their absence has become so familiar. And they know this. They understand that they've created this dynamic. They understand that you've become neurologically dependent on their presence. Some Sigma INFJs do this unconsciously, operating from a place of their own attachment trauma, but many do this with full awareness. They understand that people who are anxiously attached are easier to control. They understand that someone terrified of abandonment will tolerate more, forgive more, and require less consistency. So they perpetuate the disappearance and reappearance cycle, because it serves them. The final and perhaps most mind-bending phenomenon is what I call the phantom effect. This is the experience of existing in a relationship with someone while simultaneously being rendered invisible. A Sigma INFJ can understand you completely, while simultaneously acting as though you don't fundamentally matter. They'll cancel plans with you to spend time with someone they've known for 2 weeks. They'll prioritize a work obligation over something you've been looking forward to for months. They'll speak about you in ways that subtly diminish your significance. And when you mention these things, they'll offer an explanation that's logical enough to question whether your hurt is actually justified. What makes this particularly devastating is that it coexists with their profound understanding of you. They're not dismissing you because they don't understand how much these things hurt. They understand perfectly. They've read every nuance of disappointment in your face. They know, with devastating clarity, exactly how much their cancellation has affected you. They're simply choosing to act as though this understanding doesn't obligate them to do anything differently. Imagine this specific scenario. You've had a difficult week. You've been looking forward to an evening with your Sigma INFJ partner for days. It's been scheduled, it's been confirmed. And then, the day of, they tell you they need to reschedule because something else has come up. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that genuinely couldn't wait. It's simply something they'd prefer to do, and they've decided your evening together is less important. When you express disappointment, they respond with something like, "I know you were looking forward to it, but I really need this." They've acknowledged your disappointment. They've demonstrated understanding of your emotional response. But they've positioned their needs as more valid than yours. And because they've shown you they understand how much this hurts, you feel guilty for being disappointed. You find yourself thinking that perhaps you're being unreasonable, that perhaps you shouldn't require someone to maintain plans simply because they made them. This is gaslighting wrapped in the language of understanding. This is someone using their empathy as a tool to justify their indifference. This is understanding deployed as a weapon. The reason all of these phenomena are so deeply destructive is that they work together to create a particular kind of psychological architecture. The Sigma INFJ has understood you. Genuinely, completely, with startling accuracy. They've seen into you in ways that felt sacred. And then they've used that understanding to systematize your harm, in ways that leave you questioning whether harm has even occurred. They've made you doubt your own perceptions. They've made you blame yourself for being hurt by their indifference. They've made you feel like your need for consistency and care is actually emotional neediness and insecurity. And here's the most crucial part. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something that happened to you through no fault of theirs. This was chosen. They understood exactly what they were doing. They knew the impact their behavior would have. They understood, with devastating clarity, that they were hurting you. And they did it anyway. The reframing that matters here is this: you were not broken by someone who didn't understand you. You were harmed by someone who understood you perfectly and decided that understanding didn't obligate them to care. You were harmed by someone who weaponized clarity. You were damaged by someone who possessed the capacity for profound empathy, and chose, repeatedly and systematically, not to deploy it in your direction. This is not your failure. This is not evidence that you're too needy, too sensitive, or too reliant on others. This is evidence that you encountered someone operating from a completely different psychological framework. Someone whose architecture allows them to see and then disengage from caring, the same way most people's architecture allows them to see a stranger on the street and not feel obligated to help them. The stranger is human. They might be suffering, but they're not your responsibility. A Sigma INFJ can see your suffering with the same clarity and feel the same lack of obligation. What matters now is this: if you've experienced this dynamic, you are not alone. There are people scattered across the world who have felt the particular devastation of being perfectly understood and then systematically harmed by that understanding. There are people who have questioned their own perceptions, their own needs, their own right to ask for consistency. There are people who have internalized the message that their longing for depth and understanding is somehow pathological rather than human. But it's not. Your need to be seen is not a flaw. Your capacity for depth is not a liability. Your desire to be understood is not evidence of emotional dysfunction. These are the very things that made you vulnerable to a Sigma INFJ, yes. But they're also the things that will allow you to build something genuine with someone who can see you and choose to protect what they see, rather than weaponize it. If you recognized yourself in these phenomena, I want to know which one landed hardest. Which one made you think, "That's exactly what happened to me"? Please leave a comment and let me know. And if you watched this video and felt, perhaps for the first time, that someone understands what you've experienced, that you're not alone in the disorienting devastation of being perfectly seen and then systematically harmed, subscribe. Because this is what we explore here. We look at the shadow side of personality psychology. We examine the ways that understanding can become a weapon. We validate your experience and help you make sense of what happened. You deserve a community that understands the particular pain of being known and then abandoned, of being seen and then invalidated. This is that community. And you've never been alone in this.